thank you everyone for joining us tonight for our bi-monthly webinar, and thank you to Rachel Bloxham for presenting tonight on understanding the relationships between production records and cow indices, so PW and LW. So Rachel is the Herd Improvement Technical Manager with LIC, so thank you Rachel for joining us this evening.
No worries.
And I will hand it over to you. Just one thing, Rachel's going to allow time to answer questions throughout the presentation, but if you have something that you feel is related to something that she has specifically said, you're welcome to raise your hand at any time. As previously, it's just in the top of your screen. Alternatively, if you don't want to raise your hand, you can type your question into the chat function or the Q&A function, and I will ask the question for you for Rachel. Otherwise, Rachel, all yours.
Thank you very much, and yeah, thank you everyone for attending this evening. So just a bit of background around how where this topic came from. So last year we made a few internal changes, and I presented that earlier this year to members of Holstein Friesian Association. I think it was board and some additional groups, add-ons. And then recently the article in the latest, which I'm not sure if has that come out. I think it was supposed to be for the October magazine.
Yep, that came out within the last couple of weeks. Yeah.
Awesome. So this is just sort of another follow-up to that, and hopefully, yeah, people have a good session. So just to kick things off, I just wanted to start off by acknowledging, while this presentation is about production worth and lactation worth, just wanted to take a step back and just give you an overview of the LIC genomic evaluation systems that operate. So we actually operate 3 evaluation systems, and you may not necessarily be aware of these. So I thought I'd just take this opportunity to advise you of these. So the first one is our official LIC genomic evaluation run. So this is our monthly run that aligns with NZAEL's schedule, and we use the same information that they do in their evaluations in terms of the pedigree and phenotypic information, but we add that genomic piece on there as well. And we update all animals on the database at once. So this is the sort of like the gold standard of all our evaluations that we do. The second one, and this is the system that we made some changes to last year, and that's called Herd GE, or Herd Genomic Evaluation. The purpose for this evaluation is to provide real-time updates to farmers when events happen on farm. So it is only run for an individual herd, and it occurs anytime we receive new event data, such as a herd test, live weight events from the herd, or the creation of a new animal. So you probably don't recognise it at the time, but if you create an animal straight away, you get a BW and a BW and a PW for those animals. So you're not having to wait for that monthly official run to get that data. And that's the same with herd test data. So it's around trying to mirror the LIC system as much as possible, but provide update evaluations for timely decisions on farms for farmers. And a more recent one that we introduced last year, so we've been operating sort of our LIC and Herd GE systems for many years, but last year with the introduction of the GMARC genomics product within LIC, we also created a third evaluation, which is what we refer to as HFNZ. So this is only run on newly genotyped young females. Again, it occurs between LIC GE runs, and again, it's about the timing of being able to provide information to farmers to make timely decisions around their calves. So there's still some work to do around here to make that information available in more frequent time frame. But at the moment, it is very much, I think, a PDF, I think, that gets emailed out, but that's what we're working towards. So when I'm talking about production worth and lactation worth today, it is going to be more focused on herd test information, and that's going to be then coming through in LIC GE and Herd GE in terms of their updates. So importance of cow valuations. So ultimately we are trying to achieve accurate valuations that support effective herd management and breeding decisions on farms. And just to recap, we've got three indices that we generate for cows. So the first one is breeding worth, which you guys should be familiar with, is the genetic ability for breeding replacements. And we include 10 traits within the breeding worth. For this presentation, we're focusing on the next two, which is production worth and lactation worth. So when we're talking about production worth, it's talking about the expected lifetime performance of the animal, and production worth represents what we expect that animal to be generating in terms of profit for each year that she is in the herd going forward. And then lactation worth, very specific to current season performance. Both of those indices are focused on production efficiency with the inclusion of volume, fat, protein, and live weight. And the only difference is we also have somatic cell feeding into the estimation of production worth in terms of expected lifetime performance. So those are the two we'll be focusing on today. So that's just a recap of the indices at a high level. So now we'll just get into that production side of things and what really influences that and how that flows through into genetic evaluations. So when we think about performance, there's a number of factors that actually contribute to the physical production or, the physical live weight of an animal. So we have a measure of performance, which we are obtaining through herd test information. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to use that herd test information to understand how much of that performance is attributed to from genetic merit, how much of it is due to environment, how much of it is management, and then there's this element of what we term residual, which are factors that can't be categorized in the other three factors. So when we get that herd test information, obviously they will feed into LACG and herd GE. But one of the key principles around genetic evaluation when we're looking at those herd test results is this concept of herd mate comparisons. So when we're looking at records, we're only comparing 2-year-old performance against 2-year-old performance, 3-year-olds against 3-year-olds, 4 against 4, 5 against 5. And that makes that comparison more common, or like it's like for like in terms of our assessment of those animals. As you can appreciate, it would be unfair to compare a 2-year-old to a 4-year-old because 2-year-olds are only producing about 80 to 85% of mature animals. So that's why this idea of herd mate comparisons is critical when we are looking at an animal's performance. The other thing that it enables us to do is when we think about that management element that influences the performance of an animal, what we'd like to, we know this doesn't always play out on farm, but in theory, the management of the animals or a mob of animals, we are saying will be exactly the same for that group of animals. They are managed the same, they are in the same paddock, so they have the same opportunity for feed. That whether they're once a day or twice a day comes into it in terms of environment and that side of it. But it's like every animal has an opportunity to produce to the same level due to management. So by doing herd mate comparisons, and we're comparing one animal against the rest of her herd mates, we're effectively able to remove that component of the management influence on production. And a big part of this is feed, different systems. So that's, we know that a system 2 isn't going to produce as much as a system 5. But every animal that has that opportunity in that system to produce to the same level in reference to that management practice. So when we then just look at the difference between performance, what we're trying to understand are those other three elements. So what's genetic merit? How much is coming from the environment, which I'll go to in a bit more detail shortly. And then that leftover bit, which is actually quite small, so it has a very minor impact on performance. So from a genetic merit point of view, especially with the uptake of genomics now, we can get a really good feel of the genetic merit of an animal. But we need herd testing information to try and differentiate between the contribution of the genetics versus the contribution of the non-genetic component, which is the environment. Recognizing, when we talk about, breeding, it's about breeding the next generation. But what we're trying to establish with production worth and lactation worth is all the non-genetic factors that are also influencing the animal's performance. So another way I like to think about it is this analogy of a cake. So imagine a cow's milk production is like a cake. So you have a recipe, and that recipe on paper never changes. It's effectively what we could define as the genetic makeup of that cake. But the other factors in terms of how the cake actually turns out is due to non-genetic factors. So the environment that the cake is made in, the ingredients, the type of ingredients that are used, the temperature of maybe some of the ingredients, the age of the ingredients, the temperature of the oven, because we all know ovens can be a bit temperamental at times. So those are environmental factors that will affect the outcome of what the cake comes out like, but can vary for every single time you make that cake. So the environmental piece is what we're trying to establish with the value of herd testing. But not all environmental effects are created equal. So when we think about got the genetic makeup of the animal, we have a good knowledge of that. When we look at the animal's performance, there's certain factors that we call permanent factors or permanent environmental effects that will affect the cow throughout her life. So a couple of examples of this is hybrid vigor or heterosis for crossbred animals, early life health incidences that will actually hinder that animal for the rest of its life, or even how well she was reared. So you could have two genetically sort of equal animals, but for one reason or another, if one of those was to have a health incident, then that is likely to affect her production going forward, and she may well not perform as well as the other animal. Genetically, they're the same, but we've got this influence of a permanent effect on that animal that's going to affect her entire life. The second part of that is what we term temporary environmental effects. So factors that change from one day or season to the next. And probably the most common one here that we see is around seasonal health incidences. So a hard calving, lameness, mastitis, they are all seasonal effects that generally a cow will recover from after that season, and it doesn't impact her in the following season. It could be something that is only short-term, like, as I say, lameness and somatic cell, that is only affecting that herd test, but she comes right and then doesn't affect the other herd tests. So it's that variation within season. And weather conditions is also one that could come into play, because different animals do have differences in resilience around how they react to weather conditions. So we're able to recognise some of that with the estimation of temporary effects coming through. So these all affect cow productivity, but the key thing is they're not passed on to her progeny. And over time, the more herd test events we obtain for an animal, the more we understand and the better we can estimate these impacts on the environmental effects. So we have good knowledge of the genetics of the animal and how that could be contributing to it. But without herd test information, we can't really understand these other non-genetic factors that are influencing an animal's performance, whether it be over her entire lifetime or within season. And that's why it's important to really try and herd test as many times as you can in the season, but also year on year, also understanding and the value of that herd test data. So from a permanent environmental effect, this element feeds into production worth. So production worth is an estimation of that genetic merit element of the animal, as well as these permanent environmental effects. And then lactation worth also uses that permanent environment information as well as that temporary. So effectively what we're doing is with each index, whether it's moving from breeding worth to production worth to lactation worth, we're adding in an extra piece of information that is helping us drive the knowledge of how well an animal is performing in the current season and how we expect her to perform across her whole lifetime. So this is sort of like looking at those three indices together as we acknowledging the extra information we are gaining from all the herd test data that we have. We can see we're actually explaining more of the variation or the diversity, genetic or performance diversity that exists within a herd. So this is using, I'm not sure, I can't remember exact numbers now, but this is looking at the indices for the 22 born, so 2-year-olds that were herd tested last season. So it's a complete season's worth of information where the animals have been herd tested. So when we think about breeding worth, it's about that genetic merit, and ultimately it's about breeding that next generation. Breeding worth is very much around what is the heritability of a trait. And for production traits, that's about 25%. Now, with genetic merit and understanding that component of the productivity that an animal's producing, we're only able to explain around that 25% of the variation that exists in a group of animals, because we're only just honing in on that genetic merit piece. When we then add the information that we've gathered around the permanent effects that are affecting an animal, we're bringing in more information, more knowledge, and we're now able to, with production worth, explain approximately 60% of the variation that exists in a herd in terms of production. And we often term this as repeatability. So how good is an animal at repeating that performance year on year, which makes sense when you think of the genetic and the permanent factors are the things that are going to contribute year on year. And then finally, with lactation worth, bringing in that extra piece of information around those temporary factors that we've estimated, we're effectively now, for the current season, explaining 100% of the diversity or variation in performance that we're seeing within a herd, within an age group. So it's really it's like a puzzle, and we're slowly continuing to add to it. We've got the genetic merit information, which is linked to the heritability. We've got how good is she repeating her performance season on season, which is an element of the genetics and those permanent factors that we're able to estimate from herd tests. And then the full variation when we start bringing in those temporary effects. So as a result of bringing in those extra information, we're able to explain more of that variation. So if you're looking at your records and you're looking across those three indices, you will see larger numbers coming out for lactation worth versus production worth versus breeding worth. So I'm happy just to pause just there if there are any questions. I know it's a lot to take in, but it's just really reinforcing the importance of regular herd testing to enable the evaluation systems to estimate those elements. And that's with any evaluation system. That's not just with an LIC. These factors is also what drives the NZAL genetic evaluations as well.
So you mentioned regular herd testing. On average, how many people normally stay 4 herd tests a year? Is that your recommendation?
That is still our recommendation, is ideally 4. In terms of our ability to accurately predict a 270-day lactation. So that's another thing I was going to mention, is when we're looking at all these herd test records, whether it's 1 herd test in a season or 4 herd tests or 10 herd tests, we're using all the available information to predict a 268-day lactation. So all the indices are standardized to a 268-day lactation using the information. And that's what enables it to be compared, like these indices to be compared across herds because of that standardization.
So herds out there that are on once a day, would you recommend them doing extra herd testing, or is still 4 where you would think is a requirement, or is the data is accurate if you're only milking once a day? What's the
Yeah, I mean,
belief in that.
yeah, absolutely. And it comes down to, we're trying to predict a 24-hour, with the herd test, we're trying to estimate a 24-hour prediction. So effectively, if you're once a day, that represents the 24 hours. It is only one sample rather than obviously twice a day getting the two samples. So it wouldn't be quite as accurate, but it's still better than two herd tests. So it's that usual thing around data is king, and the more data points we can get, the better. But acknowledging, if we only have one or two, how that actually influences the results and the confidence that farmers can have in the evaluations. So ideally, if you were happy to do a fifth herd test, if you're a once a day herd, go for it. But we know that's always a sort of like a tricky discussion when it comes to herd testing, and just farmers just don't like it. But it's just trying to find that sweet point around getting enough data points to be able to estimate each of the components that make up that animal's performance.
Yeah. So a couple of questions that have come through. Do you pull information from CRV and other companies as well, or LIC only?
No, so we when we do our monthly runs, we use the same phenotypic and pedigree data that NZAEL use, which is the full data set, because we know that there will be LIC genetics and CRV herds and CRV genetics and LIC herds, and it's important that we maintain all those relationships for the integrity of a national system. And so we utilise, that's our foundation as well for our LIC GE system. Yep.
There is a lot of talk about kgs of milk solids versus kg of live weight. Will it be useful to weigh the cows? What will happen with the information, and what is the best time of the year to weigh them if it is useful?
Yeah, great question. So ideally, we try and tell farmers more like in the North Island, weigh sort of October, November, early December. You probably get an extra month if you're more down south. The idea is we don't really want it to be onerous on farmers. So trying to tie it in with mating, harvesting, and all that sort of stuff, but not too late in the lactation, because we do really want to just aim for those first 2 trimesters of an animal's pregnancy. We don't have a way of accounting for fetal weight in late lactation, and that can start sort of just influencing the results a bit. So it's sort of like September through to December, August, September, so late September through December, and then you've probably got another month as you move into South Island. But the key thing is ensuring that all the animals in the age group is weighed on the same day, as close together, and not half the herd weighed in the morning having just come out of milking, and the other half weighed in the afternoon having come just off the paddock. So effectively those two groups haven't been managed in the same way at the time of collecting the event. So that will influence. So there is a little bit of caution needed to be around how you do that.
And I know that there's a lot of farms out there that have the walkover scales. Are they adequate enough for measuring the weights that you're wanting, or are you finding that they can be a lot more variable?
So there was some work done both by LIC and NZAEL, I think back in 2018, when we were looking at the accuracy of the walkover weighers, and we found that it was still doing a really good job of prediction. We needed to make sure that there was some filtering of the data in terms of the extreme weights at either end, but that's like with any event that we get, especially even like herd test records. There are extreme herd test records that won't get included in genetic evaluations. And we were close to actually getting walkover weight added into the evaluation system, but it just never came to fruition. But ideally, static weights where you're getting the animal to stand in the crush is better than walkover weights, because there is always that chance of animals having like 2 animals on the scale at a time.
Stuck and trailering each other.
Yeah, exactly. Keen to get out of the shed and into the paddock.
Yep. So I don't have anything else that's come through to me.
Cool.
So you can continue. Yep, go ahead.
Cool. So that's a lot of the theory. So what I wanted to do is actually just bring up a bit of a real life example. So we identified a Holstein Friesian herd from last season, all spring calving, about 400 cows, and they had done 4 herd tests for the season. And so just wanted to use this data to just show a breakdown of that age group contemporary and how we look at the variation that exists within an age group, and then doing that comparison between kilograms of milk solids, production worth and lactation worth, because one of the most biggest questions that we always get all the time is, I've got an animal doing X amount of kilograms of milk solids, but her PW is this or her LW is this, and just trying to make that connection. So what we have here, so this is for lactation worth. So we've taken for the 24-25 season, what the accumulated lactation of kilograms of milk solids for the lactation was for the animal. And we've plotted that against what the lactation worth was at the end of the season. So this is just showing it for all the age groups in that herd. And you can see that there is a nice correlation between, generally cows that are producing more kilograms of milk solids generally will have a higher lactation worth. Now, obviously, there is a little bit of caveat around this because we are only talking about milk solids. And so we're only talking about 2 of the 5 traits that are going into production worth, or two of the traits going into lactation worth. So there is that element, obviously, of live weight feeding into what would be contributing to the lactation worth as well. So that's why you do get a bit of scatter. So the ideal relationship with anything when you're looking at 2 things like that would be to have a straight line right up the middle to show that there's a 1-to-1 relationship between whatever your x-axis is and your y-axis. But this is showing a nice correlation between the 2. So that's for lactation worth for this herd. And then this is what the production worth looks like. So you can see there's a bit more scatter, remembering that lactation worth is only about that season. So it will be more strongly correlated to that season's kilograms of production produced, whereas production worth is having more information from historical seasons as well. So that will be contributing through it. But generally there is a good correlation. Now, there is a caveat with this herd, unfortunately, when I started looking into this, is that while they did herd tests for 4 times last year, they weren't regular herd testers prior to that. So normally, if you've got many seasons of herd tests coming through, you probably would see a bit more scatter in the production worth when comparing against the last season's kilograms of milk solids. But the correlation is still going to be, or that relationship is still going to be positive. So let's delve into a couple of the age groups now for this herd. So purely looking at the 2-year-olds in the herd, again, kilograms of milk solids on the x-axis, y-axis, and lactation worth on the x-axis. So this is for 2-year-olds, 4 herd tests. Well, the herd had 4 herd tests. Whether every individual animal did or not is a different story, and we'll go into that in a little bit. But with 4 herd tests, we are getting a really good understanding of how those animals are performing in the current lactation. So generally, those that are producing really well are coming through with the higher lactation worth. We don't have any other information feeding in, but so you are going to get a little bit of scatter. So if I was looking at this, obviously what really stands out to me are these 2 girls at the bottom. So I'd be questioning what's going on with these 2 girls. Is there something that has impacted them through the lactation, especially from a health perspective, that has meant they potentially haven't produced to their true potential? Ultimately, farmers, the owners of the cows or those that are milking the cows and seeing them every day, will have greater knowledge around what's going on. So that's where, you know, while this is a representation of a end of season lactation worth, at any herd test, you're going to see, you know, potential outliers, especially in the first herd test of the season and with 2-year-olds. You really want to look at, is there anything going on with those animals? So LW is a really good indicator of being able to look at those extreme animals and just trying to understand what's going on. And interestingly, with these two, it's got nothing to do with the fact that they had a hard calving that I could see or that I would know of. But they're actually a different breed. So so compared to the rest of the herd, which are predominantly Holstein Friesian, these two are an alternative breed that is not necessarily bred for milk production. So they are definitely at the lower end of the scale. This girl, however, I thought was very intriguing, given that she'd only done at the end of the season, we'd only recorded about 220 kilograms of milk solids, yet she's still got an LW coming through over 1,000. So looking into her, she's only done 129 days of milk. So while the herds had 4 herd tests, she's only had 2 or 3 that are actually contributing to her lactation worth. But the more interesting thing is she's actually got quite an extreme fat percentage feeding into the evaluation. So that would be where I'd be looking at her actual herd test results and going, was that a clean sample taken at the time of the herd test? Is there something else playing out for her? Because I don't think that what we have for her is actually a true representation of what she could generate for the farmer in this case. So those are the sorts of things that we're throughout the season looking at, that LW piece, especially early on, can come into understanding and highlighting issues that might be going on for individual animals. Now, when these are 2-year-olds, and now when we shift over to looking at how they're tracking from a production worth point of view, you can see a very similar trend, which purely makes sense given we've got 4 herd tests generally contributing to the LW, and we've got 4 herd tests contributing to our estimate of production worth. So for 2-year-olds, you generally should see a really good correlation between those 2 indices when you're looking at them. And we've got our 2 down the bottom where we're saying, based on their first year's performance, we really aren't expecting them to do well throughout their entire life. And so that's why they've been penalised, because we're using, you know, for production worth, we're using the knowledge of the genetics and the knowledge of the permanent environment to predict how they're going to perform in the future. And so based on this one season, we're saying they're just not going to produce. Does that all make sense?
Yep, that's reasonably clear.
So now I just want to tell us time 76. Okay, so just want to now take you on to the 5-year-olds in this herd. So again, looking at lactation worth, you can see that strong correlation between kilograms of milk solids for that season and their lactation worth for that season. Again, there's a girl there that is on the lower end of production and is also lower on lactation worth. I didn't specifically look at her for this example because I just wanted to highlight another cow for a different reason. So this particular cow, you can see there that she is doing about 550 kilograms of milk solids in the herd, potentially in the top 10 when you're looking at those animals that are producing really well from a production point of view. And as a consequence, she does have a good lactation worth for this season. So remember, the lactation worth is about her genetic merit, her permanent factors, but also those temporary factors. So based on what we know of the herd test, estimating those 3 elements, we're saying that she's produced really well for this season, which is fantastic. Now, however, when we come to looking at production worth, this is her here. So she's actually got a production worth of just under, like maybe minus 20, maybe minus 50. So you can think, well, she's producing really well now, but why is her production worth not showing that? And that's because at 5 years of age, she's now had 4 years of producing, albeit in this example, as I said, we don't have herd tests for every single one of those years. But interestingly enough, remember when we're talking about these three indices, genetics does contribute to it as well. So the fact that for these 5-year-olds, we don't have as many herd tests as we would like, we are finding a little bit harder to differentiate what might be genetic merit versus what might be permanent environment. And what is actually driving her production worth to be negative is the fact that her genetic merit and her BW is negative. So that's still contributing to that production worth due to that lack of her test information. We can only estimate these with the data that we've got. So what you would normally find, and it's just such a shame that I only picked this up late in the piece, that they didn't have a lot of herd tests, is that, as I say, you would tend to have for 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, a bit more scatter coming through because you're looking at how she's performed over her whole life and our prediction of what her performances is year on year versus just that LW around how she's performing this season. I'll pause if there's any questions.
Just one. So I guess that kind of then explains what would happen if a cow missed the season. That could be what's causing that then, wouldn't it?
Yes, and what we do when we do miss a season, because to be able to estimate any of these indices, we effectively need a record for every season. But when we don't have data for that season, we use knowledge of what data we do have to infer how we would predict her to perform. And because we've got that genetic piece that we have strong confidence in, but from a production point of view, less data, then yeah, it's about the weighting on that and all those different sources of information. Yeah.
A bit of a weird one. Extended lactation. How, more and more farmers out there now are looking at 18-month seasons. How is that then affecting PW and, well, I guess LW, especially because your lactation's not 280-something days, it's, a lot longer than that.
Yeah, so where the principles around the genetic evaluations is that we will only estimate a 260-day lactation, but we will use herd test records up to 305 days. So effectively, any herd test that occurs where the animal will be in excess, including extended lactations, those herd test records aren't used in the genetic evaluations. And the main reason for that is, if you remember back earlier in the presentation, I was talking about that concept of herd mate comparisons or contemporary groups. The more animals you have to compare against in a contemporary group, the more knowledge we can draw from those comparisons. The smaller the contemporary group, the less accuracy or less knowledge we can draw. So with, we just don't have enough of those animals in the system yet to really understand how we could incorporate them into a extended lactation view of lactation worth. So we need to probably get more data coming in, do the research to then look at, can we generate a extended lactation index for those that are doing beyond that. So it is very early stages, and until we get more data, we'll be sticking with the 268-day prediction using herd tests up to 305 days. And that's for BW, PW, and LW.
So I guess for the herds that the whole herd is an extended lactation, then that's fine, because their whole herd will be that contemporary group. So it's just for those herds that maybe milk through some empty cows or something like that and do 2 full years with them, it'll be a little bit different.
Yeah, but even if for those that where the whole herd is on extended, we just don't have enough data or knowledge around those later herd tests to be able to use that for our evaluations and our predictions. So we need to get more data, which is the whole purpose of like the trials with Dairy NZ are doing, those sorts of things, is to collect the data to understand all the interactions and all the factors that could influence an extended lactation. Yep.
So we just need more people to herd test.
Yeah.
Has anyone else got anything else? Otherwise, Rachel can continue. Go ahead, Rachel.
So, I mean, what would have been really nice to be able to see, and we just didn't have the opportunity to do it, is that while what I've presented to you was PW and LW at the end of the season, but also acknowledging that how does LW and PW change through the season with each herd test. So with one herd test, we have one data point to estimate the lactation worth for an animal. And if it's a high flyer, we might overestimate her prediction for that season. But then as we get more herd tests, she may re-rank as we get more knowledge. So again, just reinforcing the more data points we have, the better our predictions for these. So this is just a image. It's a computer simulation where we've generated like 100,000 events for effectively phantom animals. And this is looking at the relationship between two lactations. So lactation 1 on the x-axis and the lactation 2 on the y-axis. And this is just really showing around the influence of the variation in those temporary environmental effects that can change from one season to another. So yes, there's still a little bit of a correlation there, a positive correlation. So generally, a cow that does well in her first lactation and has a good lactation worth will have a good chance of having a good lactation worth in the second lactation. But there's a lot of spread. There is variation because they are temporary effects. You say one cow will have an issue one season, the next season there's no problem and she's high flyer. So that's just to sort of show you, though, that there is still a little bit of correlation. And then taking it out 5 years, when you look at if we took all the lactation worths we've generated for an animal over their 5 lactations and we average that LW, then it has a strong correlation to what we are predicting the production worth to be at that point in time. Which effectively what we're saying is production worth is about the genetic merit and those permanent environmental effects. Over time, by averaging out LW over the lactations, you could have some seasons where that temporary effect is going to be positive and other seasons it's going to be negative. So by averaging out those LWs, you're effectively nullifying the temporary effects, which is why you're getting that strong correlation. But again, shows you how much variation that can exist in LW with those temporary factors at play. So I've touched on this a little bit before, but just an extra note around that first herd test caution when it comes to the lactation worth that gets generated. So with breeding worth and production worth, they have a reliability associated with them, and that's to provide you an estimation of confidence in that index and how much data is actually contributing to that estimate. With LW, there is no concept of reliability. So if we've got one data point, we're using that one data point to predict the full variation that may exist for that lactation for a group of animals. But as you can appreciate, one must use a bit of common sense when the LW is only based on one herd test, as one herd test is not the same as having a lactation of multiple herd tests. And that's where you get the re-ranking over time within season. So this image was actually, I did this earlier in the year, so it's a little bit out of date, but the principle is still the same. So you've got the orange line there that represents the first herd test for the season for a group of animals from the 24-25 season, and the variation or the range in lactation worths that existed. So we've got a high flyer and we've got some really poor cows that aren't performing. And as a consequence, we're getting some really high and low lactation values and lactation worth coming through. But as you get more herd tests, you're getting more knowledge around those permanent and temporary factors that are affecting that cow for the season. And you start getting the more confidence in the narrowing of those values or the range that exist. And that's where you would like to say you'll get re-ranking as well, because guarantee that that top heifer generally isn't always going to be your top heifer, especially if it's real extreme. So that's just, again, just reinforcing some importance around that. So using production worth and lactation worth on farms. So as I mentioned, production worth is about the lifetime productivity of the animal that we're trying to estimate. The importance of this is really in animals' early life, because ideally we're wanting to use those first few lactations to estimate, is she worth retaining in the herd or not? And generally, as saw before, there is generally, if a cow doesn't perform well in her first lactation, there's a high chance that she won't perform well in her later lactations. And that's where looking at production worth gives you that prediction of future performance, and then using that information to make decisions around culling and retention for animals on the farm, especially those earlier lactations or earlier age groups. And recognising over time, you're going to get less movement with production worth, because your first lactation, you have, say, 4 herd tests, second lactation, you have 8, third lactation, you have 12, but in terms of doubling, you're only adding in so many extra events each time, so the weighting will dilute. The other thing to note is with production worth, and this comes back again to the size of contemporary groups and the availability of being able to use herd test records with good accuracy. We actually only use herd test records up to the animal's 7th year. So once she actually calves down as an 8-year-old, the evaluation system, both NZAEL and consequently ours as well, will no longer use the animal's herd test information once she reaches 8 years of age. When you think about the principle of production worth, again, like I just said, it's about trying to make a decision about a cow as to whether she's worth keeping in the herd or whether you want to replace it with the more superior animal. If she's still in the herd after 5 lactations and she's managed to reach 7, 8 years of age, there's a reason why she's there. It might have been because you've had the inability to cull on production because of other factors. But then sort of when you get to that age, historical production really isn't important anymore, because that's in the past. You don't get paid on that. So that's when lactation worth comes into its own in terms of those older animals, because that's then looking at it on a season-to-season basis. Is she continuing to excel, or is she actually starting to drop off in terms of that lactation worth season to season? And as mentioned earlier, that looking at that lactation worth, especially for young animals, over the season to see if there's any trends or droppage, and really looking at those animals that are excelling or struggling to understand what's actually happening with their records, whether there's an error with the herd test, or whether there's something else happening that you can correctly identify and intervene earlier on, so then you're still maximising the production from that animal for that season. So that's where that LW can come into its own. So just bringing it all together, going back to what we're trying to draw out of a herd test sample. So I talked about those management factors or common factors that we're saying will contribute the same amount of performance for every animal. So by having that same herd, same season, same year, same age commonality, we can remove those factors out of that performance or herd test that we've received. And then recognising that the 3 key components are around your genetic merit of the animal, which is linked to the heritability of the traits, contributes to breeding worth, adding in that permanent environment element that only is expressed by that cow. It's not genetic, that it's passed on to progeny, that gets expressed in the production worth. And then finally, those temporary factors, which will change season to season. And as we add more of that detail into our estimates, moving from BW to PW and LW, we are explaining more of the variation that exists, or the diversity that exists in animal performance in your herds. So hopefully that wasn't too technical and you got something out of that. If anything, the importance of herd testing and then understanding how that herd testing is actually used to try and break down and understand those genetic, permanent and temporary factors that contribute to a cow's performance. So thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you, Rachel. I guess any final questions, feel free to push them through now. I just have one more question for you. How long kind of post-calving is the perfect time for you to do your first round of herd testing? I know most people around the Waikato start in about September, but is there kind of an optimum so many weeks? Or I know calving spread is 10 to 12 weeks, but, you know, is there an optimum in there?
Yeah, so there is within, I know, and I'm sure CRV has the same thing for their herd testing service. So there is sort of a calculation that sits behind when our herd testing team are trying to identify the best dates. And that first herd test is really about trying to maximise and capture as many of the cows that have calved down up to that point, but within 60 days of calving, ideally, because there is a rule within the calculation of the accumulated lactation. So when you get your X amount of kilograms of milk solids that you've got for the cow for the year, that calculation is based on that first herd test. It's based on that first herd test and 60 days prior. So if you end up getting a cow that's been calved 70 days prior to that first herd test, then that algorithm for the calculation of accumulated lactation will not pick up those 10 days right at the start. So just to acknowledge too that the calculation of accumulated lactation is quite different and separate to how AE system uses it. So the optimization of the herd test is effectively more aligned to trying to capture days of milk with the accumulated lactation. From an evaluation point of view, it just acknowledges when did she calve and therefore how many days into her lactation is that herd test associated with. And there is an algorithm that sits within animal valuation that acknowledges how many days into her lactation she is, recognising that a cow in peak is obviously going to produce more than a cow 15 days from calving.
Awesome.
Cool. So
looks like you just get questions from me tonight. Sorry, Rachel.
Oh, that's all right. I hope the others everyone else has got something out of it. But I just wanted to say, yeah, if you ever have any questions around indices for an animal, definitely send them through. We're more than happy to delve into the detail that sits behind that evaluation and actually fine tune and look at what's actually driving her indices, look at her historical performance and just provide some insights around the evaluations that you are seeing, even if it's at a trait level. We don't have to specifically talk about BW and PW, but even at a trait level. More than happy to help out. Team's more than happy.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Well,
cool.
That's always interesting when no one asks questions, but I'm hoping that means that the information that you've given to everyone tonight has answered all the questions they have. So as Rachel said, if you wish to get in contact with her team, then feel free to reach out through to LIC. But thank you again, yes. Rachel.
No worries. So yeah, just on that, if you email through to herdimprovement@lic.co.nz, then yeah, my team will pick that up.
Great, thanks, Rachel. And we can link that on the YouTube as well, where this will end up. So again, just thank you, Rachel. That was really informative. I really enjoyed it. Said I bombarded you with my questions tonight, but that's okay.
Good questions.
Thank you everyone for joining, and yeah, this will be available on our YouTube, so if you want to go back and listen, or if there's something that you didn't feel was quite clear and you just want to hear it again, feel free. The team should have it up in the next day or so, and as Rachel said, if you want to get in contact with her, you can. But thank you, Rachel, for your time this evening, and everyone for taking part, and enjoy the rest of your hopefully sunny, where everyone is, evening tonight. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you.